Hey everyone, welcome to More Than Numbers Live, a show focused on turning data teams from support functions into engines of growth. I'm Ollie Hughes. I'm one of the co-founders of Count.co. We're a Canvas-based BI tool. We're all about turning data teams from dashboarding factories into their organization's problem solvers. Every week we get another industry leader tell us how they're driving value with data in their organizations. And this week, I'm really pleased to announce we've got Phillip van Blerk joining us. He is a friend and one of the most tattooed data people I know. He is a man who's had 25 years in data across various different things, including running a hedge fund. He is now currently the director of financial data at Monzo, and he's going to talk to us about data team's secret weapon, the fact they can see everything. Phillip, thank you so much for joining me. How are you?
Thank you for having me. I'm doing well, thanks.
Well, look, Phillip, we know each other very well, but I want to make sure other people get to know who you are and where you've come from. And the first question I want to ask every guest is, tell us the first data tool that you fell in love with other than Excel in your career. Can you give us the flavor of when you first started realizing data was your thing?
Yeah, so I at university, we used a tool called S+. The language of S+ is called S, which is now R. And so S+ had this whole really cool studio where you would have sort of a spreadsheet kind of thing. You can do your visualizations, etc. But at the core was R. So that was a very exciting start for me. But then, unfortunately, when I moved into the financial markets, I regressed into Excel and only made it out of that, out of the matrix much later when I moved out of financial markets back into banking, etc.
There you go. That's cool. I've never heard of S. The idea there's a precursor to R makes you realize that you are a very wise man who's been around for a bit. That's really cool. Thank you. So look, before we dive into the content, I want to we call it like show us your stack. Tell us a bit more. You're currently at Monzo. You're director of financial data, which sounds, given they're a bank, sounds like quite an important job. But maybe you could tell us more what that means, and also, tell us a bit more about your data stack and how data is structured in Monzo generally.
Sure. So we are doing basically data mesh 2.0. So we have embedded data teams through the organization, what we call collectives. So finance is one of the collectives. So we have disciplines. Data would be one discipline, and within that, within your collectives, you'll have some different disciplines depending on what the collective does. So I'm looking after effectively the data team within finance. Monzo is what's called a newer bank. So we don't really have that much legacy issues. So one of the things that's quite impressive is that we are running everything, or whole backend is run on microservices, which is not new. But what is impressive is that from the beginning, we ingest all of our events. And that's the bulk of our data ingestion. It's just happening through events, through something called Firehouse that was built in-house. We use AWS for our engineering stack or engineering cloud provider. We have this weird thing where we sit in GCP, Google Cloud Platform, for all of our data things. So BigQuery, so we have to move everything across from AWS to BigQuery. As I said, bulk of our ingestion is happening through this thing called the Firehouse. Then we use Fivetran for some of our other source systems. We use BigQuery as our central data store, so that'll be our data lake, et cetera, et cetera. Then in terms of being able to, so for our transform layer, we use DBT. We've done some really amazing developments with DBT, and it's quite impressive, actually. And then in terms of our front end, it's Looker, which works very nicely with Google, obviously.
Yeah. I got to say, I'm not sure how much this is public, but the down on the street is that like what Monzo has with DBT is quite different, quite unique. There's been a lot of customization.
No, very much so. It's quite impressive, and it's we get the most out of DBT through a whole a lot of tools that we develop internally, which makes your life much easier when you work with DBT.
That's amazing. And tell us, and you mentioned before that you're in finance. What are the responsibilities that you have, particularly that your team are owning within finance? Is that okay to share?
Yeah, sure. So effectively, finance is divided in two areas: treasury, which makes sense, we're a bank. Then Secondly, well, I suppose as primary is what we would call strategic finance. So those will be your classical financial functions. So we, on the one hand, we're doing very traditional, what you would expect for a data team to be doing in finance, reporting, those kind of things. Because we're a bank, we have quite a large regulatory burden. So there's a lot of work that goes into that.
Glad to hear it. Glad to hear it.
And then on the other hand, on the treasury side, it would be doing more what you expect from a data team in a finance area. So it would be things as exciting as pricing up swaps, coming up with trading strategies, etc. So it's quite varied.
That's awesome. That's really interesting. I mean, obviously, Monzo is one of the most successful UK tech stories, one of the biggest kind of new banks going. It has such an accolade in the data space, particularly as a team. It's one of the most lauded in terms of how data driven the organization is. So I'm looking forward to digging more into exactly how you're digging value in a second. First off, I want to just remind people about how we're going to frame this interview and how we frame the series. So I'm going to bring up the tenets of data value. And I know that Philip, you and I have talked about this many times, that there are kind of four pillars which we consider to be data team value. First one is operational clarity, the idea of data teams not just being report builders, but they're trying to clarify, make the business feel simple and make sure the business understands itself really well. Secondly, we have problem solving, not just being a ad hoc request data mart, but actually helping the business to tackle difficult challenges, minimizing time to decision, and measuring yourself. And Philip, what I want to spend our time on today, the thing I'm really grateful for you to speak about is just what you've often called to me like the secret weapon of a data team, the thing that is in the data team perhaps quite unique for alongside finance and the executive team, which is like being the glue, the thing that holds the organization together. Can you, when you say that to me, like, and you say it to other people, what does that mean? Give us a sense of like what it is to be the glue and why that's important.
So I think that what you need in your organization is a common language. Obviously, you have your overarching vision and mission and strategy, and I think that's what you would have in common. But after that, it could easily splinter because you would break down your overall vision into the different areas. And what is the thing that connects all of us is actually data. Data, if done well, is objective and helps us, if we do it well, to be able to, when we talk about how many customers we have, we should agree on that. When we talk about customer growth, we should be able to agree on that if we do data well. And if you think about that, that gives you then a wonderful way to interact with different areas because we end up all speaking the same language. So if you think about data, I suppose finance is similar, but data sees everything. We are not supposed to be in a very particular area. So not only we are effectively the custodians of all data in your organization, which makes you the custodian of, let's call it, all objective truth in your organization, again, if done well. And so when I talk about the glue, that's what I mean. It's the thing that should keep the whole organization together and aligned. Ideally, when you think about your organization, you want to have a couple of metrics that you follow, that you measure, that you track. And again, your data team will be the custodians of that.
Yeah, I love that. It's it's like the taxonomy that the data team creates the taxonomy that everyone is talking to, thinking about. And it's another way of putting the kind of operational clarity thing, right? That the worst thing, one of the unique things about being in data, which I think people often forget, is that they, as you say, they have oversight of the entire business. They're not shouldn't be, at least as a function, pigeonholed into just one part of the business. They should be getting data across the business and weaving that into a taxonomy that everyone can understand. And you trigger me because I talk a lot about operational clarity, and the way you put it is like it makes it even more essential. If there's not a common team focused on taxonomy, on definitions, and being that truth sayer, then you're just creating more chaos in otherwise already an organization which is probably pulling apart anyway. That's so cool. Yeah, it's an interesting. I mean, so the idea of being a truth sayer, that is often people's biggest. Like, people often talk about data quality as their focus, and I guess this is part of the truth saying thing. But it's not all that's about. Data quality is important, but being a truth sayer has a much more elevated perspective. Like, what do you mean when you say truth sayer? You're talking more than just accuracy there. You're talking about narrative. Like, what else is there to think about?
So, I mean, I think if you think about data quality, it's a means to an end. The end goal is this concept of objective truth, which, as I said, your data team would be the custodians of that. So, but with that comes a whole bunch of things. You mentioned clarity of definitions, so important, and not only clarity, but also versioning of definitions so that you can trace history, clarity of change over time. All of those things would then ultimately make up what is the objective truth of your organization. Again, nice analogy with finance in the sense that the what cash flow is should mean the same thing through the whole organization. In fact, ideally, should mean the same thing across organizations. So that and that's a requirement if you want to be a listed entity, right? There's a very strict definition of what it means to be what cash flow means, so that different analysts can analyze the same organization. So it is ultimately a huge responsibility sitting with this this objective truth and making sure that it is well looked after, well maintained. And data quality then is crucial to be able to achieve that. But if you're telling me your data team's main responsibility is data quality, then I feel your organization will end up falling short of what it can ultimately achieve.
Yeah, I think that's so. I mean, I wanted. There's a lot to tease out here in the idea of like the similarities and differences between a data team and a finance team. I think it's really interesting what you say about like the auditable definition. Like one of the things that holds finance to account is an external auditor. The fact they are they are professionals who have a standard externally to their organization that they're held to. And I think that does give them a degree of like, this is the way we do things. And in data, I guess it's probably maybe there is a similarity in that kind of need for standardization. But I guess the difference in data is that people can create their own versions of what a user could be. There is a nuance for each business. No one is defining user the same way across every new bank in the market because there's necessarily no need to do that when it comes to those metrics. Whereas in finance, it has to be exactly the same across the board. That's interesting. Absolutely. So it's an interesting way of putting it, and that's where there's a similarity and a difference. Is there? I mean, I guess there's therefore quite a lot to be learned from a finance team and how they run and how they manage those metrics that maybe data teams can pull from too.
Well, definitely. I think that, I mean, if you think about originally, a lot of your BI teams originated in finance, again, because of this idea that it sits across the full organization. I think then when we moved into, I think then a lot of it ended up sitting with engineering. And I think we're finding a nice return with data teams.
I mean, I just feel like there's so much, there's a lot of similarities and there's lots of differences between finance teams and data teams. Like how much can data teams learn from the fact that how finance teams have been tackling this problem of standardization of definitions and that kind of truth saying for a while? Like, tell us more about that.
So, I mean, if you think about it, your BI teams originated, a lot of BI teams originated in finance. And then later on, they were spun out because the value was seen to be able to go further than finance. But that concept of definitions of auditability that you mentioned, an audit trail, which is so important for us. The concept of lineage, which we talk about in data, that is so important when it comes to finance. When you think about, I remember when I did accounting at school, we were not allowed to use, that white paint you used to put over your writing, so that if you want.
Oh yeah, magic marker. Or Tipex.
It's called Tipex,
but I'm sure it's Tipex.
Yeah. It's called Tipex. Anyway, in accounting, you were not allowed to do that. You would scratch out what was written there, and then you would write next to it to create that audit trail, right? So the idea of immutability, which is something I would hope that we all think is important in data, that comes out of finance, and that's again, it's something that a lot that we can learn from finance in terms of those let's call it best practice when it comes to dealing with data.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, the similarities are, very, very similar. I mean, I actually haven't really realized it before, but things like you mentioned strategic finance in the Monzo department, like I guess they're trying to work through problems, business cases, trying to dig in for how to get further. And that's often a thing, as we discussed in the tenants, that problem solving is a key value driver of a data team. that they're tackling the organization's biggest problems. That may not be in finance, it may be in product, or it may be in marketing, but it's exactly the same principle, just a different domain. And you're right, there's so many similarities between them. It's just that data has, I guess, has a slight weakness insofar as an advantage maybe, that there's no external auditor of what standards are that you have to meet, which can be a good and bad thing.
For sure, except obviously for us sitting in finance and being a regulated bank.
For you, different, yeah.
There are certain definitions that sit outside of the bank, and that we can't mess with.
If Monzo get are not auditor knocking on the door after this interview, I really apologize. That's not what Philip said.
No, definitely not. No, look, I mean, the point is that's what I said, right? The regulator states a whole bunch of definitions. And there's no room for interpretation for us what we think it means. A highly liquid asset is defined by the regulator. We do not have the freedom to choose what that means.
Yeah, yes, absolutely, yeah, and that's true for you as a finance team, a data team in finance. But the similarities are really striking, and that general data teams can learn a lot from their finance team and how they operate. That's the key. I think the key takeaway for people who aren't in just a financial function. I also want to ask you more? One of the things which I find really fascinating in this area is you mentioned how data teams have actually spun out of finance, and that's it's helped us to think about that legacy. I actually find when I talk to data teams and see organizations with data teams who actually report to the CFO rather than say the CTO or the head of product, which can often happen, they definitely have a different flavor. They definitely have a different kind of flavor of data team. They act more like the bookkeepers, or maybe understandably the bookkeepers, or they're the ones measuring, maybe rather than perhaps being the ones on the other side of the fence trying to drive value. There's a pro and con of that, but I find it's really fascinating to see there's a different flavor depending on where the data team reports into, and maybe that's something you've seen in different roles before, like how you see data teams flavor impacted by where they're reporting to.
So look, I think when we talk about data, we are actually talking about three things. We're talking about data, the thing that's being captured. We're talking about technology, and then we're talking about some kind of mathematical technique, whether that's just aggregations or counting or whatever it is. So it is all three of those things. And I think that you should not have that as narrow as only within, for argument's sake, your CFO, because as much as, I don't think of the finance team as where you find your newest technology, because you need stability in finance, not necessarily novelty. So I think that a team, my preference is for your data team effectively to sit outside of finance. And the other problem you face is that finance is incredibly demanding in terms of the frequency and the quantity of questions. And therefore, in our case, having a dedicated data team makes sense. But I can just think that if your data team purely sits there, what happens to operations, for argument's sake? Who answers their questions? I think my preference definitely would be for your data team to sit ideally in technology.
I think that's a really good thing. Yeah, at a certain scale, you need to make sure that you're servicing the finance department as any other function, but the value of a data team comes from this, is the problem-solving aspect rather than the measurement. And I think that's a really good. I think it's a really good shout. That's definitely what I've seen. There's a different kind of tension, a different kind of vibe if you're working into the finance only, and I think appropriately so. But it's not something it doesn't come for free. I think that's really good. Let's also talk about the other thing I wanted to grab you is just really about how much, if you're not in specifically finance as a data person, if you're a data team who sits, say, reporting to the CTO in a slightly smaller organization to Monzo, how much do you need to be aware of financial concepts? How much is that an advantage if you're in that position? You obviously ran a hedge fund before even getting into data, so you obviously have that financial background. How much has that helped you as you've gone into different, more generic data roles in your career?
So, I mean, let me answer your first question. I think that being a subject matter expert always will be an advantage, because it slows you down when you have to try and find someone who can actually answer the questions, right? Realistically speaking, data is not the truth. It's a representation of the truth. So you desperately need someone who actually knows what the truth is. And that would be your domain expert or your subject matter expert. Now, just think of the advantage of maybe coming from there. Let's imagine having been a finance person or coming from operations and going into data. I think it's very valuable. However, I think any data person, I don't think it's enough for a data person to say, oh, I work with a subject matter expert. I think you need to bridge the gap properly. You need to make sure that you start to understand the subject matter that you are working on. So whether that would be operation, whether that would be finance in our case. So the question is, how does it benefit me where I am now? Well, that's very much why I was appointed. That's what made me a good candidate for this role, was exactly that background. Because as I said, it's on the one hand, we've got treasury, where you sit with the balance sheet of the bank that you need to apply profitably and responsibly. So from that point of view, I needed that. But then also you need to have some form of an idea of basic accounting and that kind of thing. So I think for me, it has benefited me a lot having come from that background.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. For the role you have, you are a unique thing. I honestly don't know. I think that's a kind of miss in the market in general, that I think there's a big need, a big skill gap in the kind of data literate finance person. I think people, particularly if you're either an accountant who knows SQL or a data analyst who does a bit of accounting, I'm constantly seeing teams looking for that kind of expertise. And so if you're looking, I would recommend anyone out there looking for an extra niche to go into, I would definitely think about that bridge between finance and data. As we've discussed, there's loads in that space in terms of similarities, operational and strategic benefits of owning both sides of the fence. So it's a really interesting space to play in, and I'm grateful for you sharing your experience. I'm now going to move on. I wanted to ask you something which is going back to your first inklings in data, or maybe I should put it a different way. Like, what's the advice to someone early doors, just getting to data, that you like, the advice that you wish you gave yourself, you got going? Just share some wisdom from someone who knew the language before R. Not to rub it in.
Yeah. So the first thing would be stay with R or S and don't move over to spreadsheets. I think that, and it specifically has to do with this idea of the very thing I mentioned, that the good principles we have in finance, immutability, traceability, auditability, all of those kind of things, you lose a lot of that, unfortunately, in a spreadsheet. The spreadsheet is incredibly versatile, but its versatility is exactly its downfall. So that the most important piece of advice I would give myself is, yes, it's more work to stick with a tool like that, but the benefit far outweighs the cost of just then finding a better way to put the data products in the hands of the people who use it. Very quick to do that with a spreadsheet, but with a little bit of effort, you can put it in a let's call it a more sustainable and a more manageable and governable way in people's hands.
Love it. I completely agree. I mean, like, the more you can, I had a similar situation where I effectively de-skilled. I used to write a lot more code at the beginning of my career than I sadly do now, and I do that. De-skilling is a loss to me and my productivity. Like, ultimately, that you mentioned it more for the repeatability, more for the auditability side of things. But I just think, the depth of the spreadsheet it would be an amazing feat.
Look,
I love it.
I'm here to plug your tool, but I think the beauty of your tool is that you do end up of Count is that you sit with the versatility. You definitely sit with the versatility, but it's transparent, right? And it's very structured, etc. So I think that having something like that, I think, is amazing.
Well, you can definitely plug my tool. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. It is definitely something which we keep seeing, that kind of transparency. The auditability is helpful to us, to anyone who needs to engage with an answer. Like, you're totally right. It's back to that piece of, like, if you've got a metric or you've got a number and you've got to make a decision, you want to know how you got there. And that's really important. That's one of the benefits of the canvas. It gives you that easy auditability, that lineage all the way through to the decision point, rather than just being an abstract number. So thank you. That was an unrequested plug, and I'll take that. Thank you. Right. Okay. I have one last thing I want to cover off with you, if I can, which is we call it the slot, the anonymous data letters. I've told people in advance that I was going to speak to you, and I asked them for some questions. This one is one I thought was most helpful. It's a bit long, so I'm going to read it from the sheet, but bear with me. This person said, I'm a data leader running a team of 7 people in a 200-person company. So obviously a bit smaller than your context, but I know you've worked in similar size orgs before. We've got some role specialization, data engineer, analytics engineer, analysts in facing into different functions. Currently, I'm feeling that we just don't have enough capacity to serve our very hungry data organization. We're looking through various self-serve options, but I believe ultimately to serve at the pace they're asking, we're going to have more headcount. The problem is we're focused on getting to profitability, I guess as an organization as a whole. So every headcount addition needs a business case. Any idea of how to go about doing that and start negotiating with my CTO and the wider exec team? That's a bit of it's a challenging situation. The business case for data head is an age-old one. Well, have you got any thoughts?
Yeah, so I think I would say you need to start by thinking about this in a different way, in that see everyone in your organization as a data practitioner, because that is just true. It's impossible for us to go through life without interacting with data and not just capturing it, but also analyzing to a certain extent or organizing it. So I think that once your view is then to say, all right, I've got 7 expert data people, and then the rest of my organization are also data practitioners, I would say your first objective should be to increase the data fluency through the whole organization. Because the moment you do that, any conversation about the value of data becomes easier because people are not on the back foot. They don't feel alienated. They understand exactly what you are referring to. So for me, as a data leader, I think it's very, very important to see your whole organization, all of them, as data practitioners, and to make sure that you are actively working to increase the data literacy and, well, one step further, the data fluency through your organization.
I love that. I love that flip. That's a really cool idea. The way that you're basically, I mean, one way you can put it, the suggestion is to sort of say, go to the CTO or the exec and say, look, we've got to increase our capacity to answer questions in the organization. There's a few options. I can get another specialist, make it 8 specialists in this organization as a headcount increase, or I need budget or time to go and train up look at the distribution of capability, and I need some budget to train or some time to train the next cohort to be operating at a higher level. I think that's really cool. You're basically putting it to, it's not necessarily headcount, it's a business case for capability. And there's different ways you can play it, and you're giving them options. But the problem is then you're still solving the problem in just a different way, and you're giving them a way to see the problem in a different light and not just a headcount number, that's really cool. I love that a lot. Funny enough, I mean, one of the things I spoke to a head of data at a slightly smaller neobank who would be a rival. But the way things that person has solved the problem is actually his organization's headcount and costs actually don't sit centrally to him. He's in charge of their management and their product management line, but the budget for the headcount for his team effectively sits in each department. So when they he's democratized out the specialists. He's basically said, if the head of product wants to get more answers, wants to move quicker, they can put a headcount into their team on their budget for an extra analyst or so. And it's amazing how he's basically democratized the budget he's basically made the business case available to each function to pull in more resources they want to go faster. And that's how he's completely done it. It's just, he's made it a kind of a market dynamic rather than it being a central pot.
Yeah, it's the same for us at Monzo, except that we have it both ways. The headcount sits, in terms of the budget, sits definitely within the collective. But we also do count in the aggregate. In other words, you want to make sure that you have enough data scientists, for argument's sake, through the whole organization, and they're not all sitting with marketing because they have the biggest budget because you're going through a growth phase. It's both and for us. But it's the same kind of idea. When I want additional data people, I speak to the CFO. I don't even speak directly to the head of data.
There we go. That's amazing. Thank you. That was a good. I think it was a good answer for the person who asked. We're out of time, Philip. Thank you so much for being here and talking about this. We've learned so much. We talked about the hidden secret, data teams being the glue, having full oversight of the whole business, and that being one of their superpowers. We've talked about the similarities between finance teams and data teams. We've talked about how to justify headcount, how to justify investment in data in general, which I think was a pretty amazing insight there. If you want to learn more, meet Phillip, hear more about Phillip, you can find him and his socials in our show notes. You can head to count.co/MTN to find more of our episodes and the show notes for this episode. Thank you so much for watching. Phillip, thank you so much for being here. I'm really grateful.
It was fun to be here. I always enjoy talking about these things, as you know.
Thank you.